what does game theory have to do with translation and localization? Maybe nothing, maybe everything, but stick around and find out. Right now, in our space, in translation and localization, AI is making translations fast, cheap, and at scale, right? You can, anything from videos with lip syncing to just texts in GPT. People have the impression that there's availability of cheapness and effectiveness at scale. And there's our reaction, the industry reaction to that. Translators feel threatened. Translators, agencies are under immense pressure, and buyers are also under immense pressure from their management to produce results. But maybe there's a bigger picture that we're missing here. Maybe this isn't just a new tool or new technological ability that we've unleashed. Maybe this is an entirely new game. So let's talk a little bit about game theory and how it helps us understand what's really going on, right? So when we think about game theory is a strategy in interconnected systems. So it was developed to make sense of what people would call rational agents, so what either rational human beings or in microeconomics or even AI agents or anything that can be deemed rational. And I'm not saying that the AI agents are, but just they do serve the purpose as far as understanding game theory goes. It's being able to understand scenarios and how they play out so that people can make decisions that maximize their gains, their output, right? So it's a framework that's built to allow people to understand how to make the best decisions that are going to produce the best kinds of results when there are multiple parties involved, when there are all kinds of differences of information available, etc., right? So it's not just what's best for me, but what's best depending on what you or other agents do, right? And we have a few classic examples of game theory in practice. For instance, during the Cold War, the US versus USSR and the whole arms race, and there was this threat of mutually assured destruction. And that was a game theory scenario that kept both parties at check because each party knew that taking action would mean mutually assured destruction. And that idea of a scenario where both parties lose it all, where the world ends basically, was sufficient enough to keep people from pressing a destructive button. Similarly, as a branch out of that, you have in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the idea of brinksmanship, right? So every side was interpreting what the other side was doing in a scenario where the actions themselves had a completely different kind of impact and and how they would understand that move. And that was also enough to keep both parties in check and deciding things that ultimately made more sense for us as a whole. After all, we're still here, and there was no nuclear event during that missile crisis. Now, another maybe more terrestrial example is around the toilet paper panic in 2020. During COVID, the fear of scarcity led to actual scarcity, right? So people feared being without toilet paper during the pandemic, which made a lot of people stock up on toilet paper, which made toilet paper incredibly scarce, which made a lot of people run out of toilet paper. So it's a really good example of how individual rational actors create scenarios where in the end, either some parties lose a lot, everybody loses, etc. So game theory explains all of this. It explains when cooperation works, when betrayal pays off, when stability is fragile, and when incentives shift, right? So in normal situations, right, without COVID, maybe, people would buy toilet paper as they needed. Maybe they would stock a little bit. Maybe a few families were outliers and had years of toilet paper stocked, but they were outliers. And in general, there was enough toilet paper to go on. But the incentive shifted during the pandemic, and all of a sudden, the threat of being without toilet paper was so big that caused a surge of toilet paper buying, which led to an absence of supply, right? And translation is now full of these dynamics that where everyone's actions impact everybody else's, right? And you have this analogously shifting landscape where the same incentives and the structures are no longer the same. So let's talk a little bit about that and what the translation game looked like before. So when you think about this old game and what it looked like, you have machine translation coming in somewhere in the 80s, but really tractioning in the late 90s and 2000s, right? That's when you really saw machine translation kick up. Even more so, I would say, around 2007 to 2010. You saw machine translation become something a lot more commonplace, a lot more, even still at that time, Google Translate was still this idea of a bad translation. They were correlated, at least from anecdotal perspective, but it did traction very much around that time. However, even though machine translation was there, the agency, the industry as a whole basically remained with the same tools, same word counts, same workflows, right? So nothing really changed that much. From a mechanical perspective, basically things were being pre-translated before they were sent out to translators. And because they were pre-translated, agencies could expect or did expect to pay less. Translators were expected to work faster. And not necessarily that any of that idea was actually playing itself out. I mean, post-editing, in my opinion, is one of the most annoying activities out there, but that's just what happened, right? People were still using the same tools, but then basically pre-filling whatever was going to be translated with machine translation suggestions. So this allowed agencies to lower prices slightly, translators to work a little bit faster, buyers to save. So this equilibrium was found where everybody maybe budged a little bit, but ultimately there was, let's say, a win-win-win scenario in the sense that the industry was still there. The lower prices enabled higher volumes. Global expansion was on the rise. Sure, some translators were disgruntled because they were making less, but overall, the industry still continued to grow. And everyone gave a little bit of cooperation, enough to keep the system intact, right? It's almost like there was this silent agreement holding this whole thing together. It was good for everybody. Maybe nobody was incredibly happy, but enough people were happy enough to keep the whole thing going, right? And that brings us to the prisoner's dilemma and why that worked for a while. So when we bring this back to game theory and this very famous prisoner's dilemma, just talking a little bit about it, you have a scenario where you have two prisoners being interrogated. And in this scenario, if one of the prisoners snitches and the other does not snitch, the person who was snitched on is going to get maximum penalty. And if both players snitch on each other, both of them are going to get medium penalties. And if no player snitches, then both of them are free, right? So there's this scenario where if both players cooperate, you have okay outcomes. If one defects while another cooperates, then you have a big win for the defector. And if both defect, everyone loses, right? So the translation world, in my opinion, mostly cooperated for years. Everyone benefited just enough to keep the model alive. But now we have a huge disruption. We have a new player in the game playing the same game that was previously in equilibrium and, in my opinion, is no longer in equilibrium. So you have AI native, not just AI native platforms, but you have translation as a feature really tractioning, right? So you have tools like Canva offering translation. You have translation available in all of the Microsoft Office pack. You have translation in all of the Google Docs and Workspace package. You have translations available in GPT. You have most softwares out there are offering some kind of translation. YouTube is offering translation. So it's basically understood that for these softwares, it's a value add using translation, and it's something that's relatively low cost. It increases user experience, adds value, maybe can even justify an increase in a subscription level. Basically, it's all upside for the companies that are AI native driven. They're not agencies, they're not linguists. They don't care about the balance or the nuance. They're basically treating language as data. And that's my definition of translation as a feature. It's not just that it's a feature there. It's like the treatment of language. It's just data. It doesn't matter if it's good, if it's bad, who authored it, who checked it, whether it represents the brand, doesn't represent the brand. It's just adding something to the to the user experience. There's no loyalty to the ecosystem at all. There's only focus on data and scale. So for them, for these agents, for these players, driving value down to pennies isn't a failure. It's exactly the business model, right? That is the disruption. It's bringing down something that hypothetically costs 20 cents a word to 0.00002 cents a word. So they're not competing, they're rewriting the game. And in my opinion, most of the industry hasn't realized that the rules have changed. Because of this scenario, and when you think about this whole game theory approach, small tweaks just aren't enough. And what are these small tweaks that we see? Right. And we see, okay, maybe slightly faster quoting, maybe more automated presentation of pricing, maybe some new UI labels so now, for instance, maybe the product isn't called anymore translation. Now it's called AI post editing, or human output managed post editing, or human enabled automatic post editing, whatever people call it. It's basically just sprinkling new labels to old things. So it's like still same mechanic. Again, you're maybe pre-translating things. Maybe it's a little bit better than, or maybe a lot better than machine translation, because now you're running it through a large language model as well. Or maybe you have a RAG framework like you do in BureauWorks, but you're still producing the same process, right? The structure is still intact. And what game theory says is when incentives shift, surface changes, they don't fix the system. It's not just about cost anymore. It's about whether the model even holds. And I'm not just talking about short term. I'm thinking about long term, right? And thinking about a scenario where technology continues to advance as it's been advancing. And I'm not talking about some grandiose advance. I'm not talking about artificial general intelligence. I'm just talking about the tech continuing to get better, right? In a very relatively conservative scenario. So here's where we have like a big fork in the road, and we have three different strategic paths that are available. So there's one path that's probably what I would guess that most larger agencies are going to follow, which is chasing the disruptors. It's a very aggressive path. You automate everything. You slash rates, you bring rates as low as you can, and you try to survive on speed and volume, right? You bank on the fact that, let's say, maybe you were charging 20 cents a word. Now you're going to go down to 2 cents a word. But because of that, you're going to be translating so much volume, and it's going to be so automated. Overhead is going to be so low that these agencies are still going to have a significant margin, even operating at 1/10 of their cost. And again, I'm projecting forwards. I'm not saying that people are necessarily doing this now, but this is ultimately the path of chasing the disruptor, right? Path number 2 would be defending the traditions, kind of like a more entrenched process. And this is where I see more boutique agencies falling. This is where I see more traditional agencies falling. So it's the idea of transcreation agencies. The idea is you're focusing on quality. This works a lot also in regulated industries as well. You're protecting rates, and you're figuring out ways to show that nuance has value. You're figuring out ways to really sell to your clients and the decision makers that quality has value, whether because it's protecting the brand, whether it's because from legal perspectives, it's protecting the company, whether it's because it's necessary for consumer adoption, really doesn't matter, but you're really finding ways to keep things the same. And then there's a third path, that this is the one that I want to propose here in this video, which is designing a new game. So in this third path, which is not, let's say, the obvious path, you use tech to remove friction, not value. And again, that's something very subtle but very important, right? I'm going to repeat that. You use tech to remove friction, not value, which means if you automate quotes, if you automate task assignments, if you automate payments, but you preserve the human layer. So let's say you automate the stuff that's actually simple, that's actually grunt work, that doesn't necessarily need to be done by a human. You not just preserve the human layer, but you enable the human layer to grow, right? If you think about a scenario A, let's suppose I'm a project manager. And let's suppose I spend 50% of my day literally typing in quotes, like inputting numbers in a system, and maybe another part of my day chasing over translators that haven't taken their task assignments, emailing people to see how they're doing with their assignments, maybe issuing invoices. All this stuff is relatively low grade. Right now, it's typically done by disproportionately high value people. So you have high value people doing relatively low grade activities. And what that creates is high overhead, number one, but it also diminishes the value that those people can add to the agency, and that the agency can thereby provide to their partners. So if you have all of a sudden these project managers, for instance, that are no longer doing this heavy lifting of automated high friction things, and now they're doing more high value propositions. For instance, maybe they're doing more strategic vendor management. Maybe they're doing more data driven quality management. Maybe they're doing more relationship building. Maybe they're being able to focus more on actual process redesign. All of a sudden, you've freed up all of this bandwidth and you've displaced it into much higher value added bandwidth. The next step is treating translators as amplifiers, not obstacles. So instead of looking at the translator as someone who needs to be bypassed or whose work needs to be minimized, and I see a lot of this, for instance, like coming especially from enterprises, like we want to make sure that translators touch as little of the content as we can. We want to make sure that translators generate as little cost as they can. Like that, this is a general mindset. The translators are seen as obstacles to cost efficiency. In my opinion, it's very different. In my opinion, if translators are working in an environment like BureauWorks, for instance, where they're interacting with an AI that is capable of learning from their decisions, of amplifying their decisions, of allowing them to really become guardians of a certain brand voice, of a certain perspective, all of a sudden they become enablers and not just cost drivers. They're enabling a much better performance of content. They're enabling a better experience from the end user. They're enabling brand growth in a certain country. And I think that's always the dream, but they need the tools to be able to do that. And they won't be able to do that with just by being post editors, just by being reduced to human output managers, or what people love to call humans in the loop, even though I would never want to be stuck in the loop myself and would never wish that on anybody. That's the idea. It's like trying to reduce people to just mere button pushers. I don't see translators as that. I see that as an immense art. I see them as cultural guardians for text. And again, that's my personal perspective, but I see this as immense value. They just need the software, the tools that allows them to do that. And maybe what I'm proposing is the harder path, and I think it is the harder path because it requires a much deeper re-examination of everybody in the supply chain of what is it that they do, right? And change is really, really hard. If you get a project manager, for instance, that was doing quoting and task placement and problem solving all of their life, their professional lives for the past 20 years, and all of a sudden say, no, you're going to do something different now. Now you're going to do strategic vendor management and you're going to do data-driven quality management. All of a sudden, maybe they don't know how to do that. And that's awesome. It's an opportunity to learn. Learning is very uncomfortable. Doing the predictable, doing the same is very comfortable. Same thing with the translator, right? If the translator was used to typing all day long and authoring words, and all of a sudden they're no longer typing, all of a sudden they're assessing text, and not just from a pure linguistic perspective, they're assessing text from a cultural perspective, from a market performance perspective. They're working a lot more closer to people who actually work for the brand. They're working as product enthusiasts. They're looking at it as a consumer would look at. They're adding a whole other layer of level of value to their work, but it's hard, right? It's not what they develop their career on. Maybe I know a lot of translators have incredible methodologies for cross-referencing things in dictionaries, and they have the exact places where they look for online, and they have developed these incredible heuristic and mnemonic devices so that they can move very quickly through text. All of a sudden, that has very little value in an environment where their role, their work, their worth is all about the value that they're able to add to text that is already good or okay, and they're making it great. They're making it amazing, right? So this change is really, really hard. And that's why my opinion is that it's not just about trying to do things a little bit differently this time around. In my opinion, now it's about time to rethink the game. And I want to emphasize that just by rethinking the game doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to change the game. It means that you're changing the vision for the game. That's why game theory isn't just about answers. It's about seeing clearly, right? It's about framing the problem in a way that actually makes sense. Because in my opinion, this isn't just a faster tool moment. It's a very strategic shift. The players are different. The rules are different. And the scoreboard is different. So it's not, in my opinion, time to play defense, right? And when we look at a survey that we released shortly, and the link for the survey can be found in this video as well, what we notice is most companies feel like they're doing a lot more work than they previously did. And they're playing defense. I mean, they're doing a lot more work, and maybe they're growing a little bit for the most part. They're like preventing maybe revenue from shrinking. Maybe it is shrinking even with all this work. I mean, it's a hard moment for our space. And that's why my opinion is that you need to ask the bigger questions. It's like, what games are we really playing? And what kind of game is really worth winning? And that's the kind of questions that are really going to require people to redefine who they are. And in my opinion, that's probably the hardest question that there is that we can ask, these deeper existential things. But that's why we're building a great community. That's why I really welcome your comments below. Thank you so much for watching. There's a link to the article if you'd like to read it as well. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for being a great part of our community. And let's keep it going with all the love. Take care. Bye-bye.